Okay, we might get started. Welcome everyone to the Climate and Energy College. My name is Nick Parry. I'm a PhD student here at the college. We have another exciting seminar today in conjunction with the Victorian Clean Technology Fund. This is a fourth in a series of seminars we've been holding on energy and innovation. Before I go further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past and present. So last week, if you were here at our seminar, we learned a little bit about the smart specialisation strategy in Gippsland. We talked about the need to build innovation ecosystems, innovation networks. We sort of have this conception in this country anyway that innovation just happens, in the garage somewhere with some, college dropout like Steve Jobs coming up with some brilliant idea. But in reality, it sort of comes through the building of innovation networks. And today we've got Dr. Adam Bumpus, who's a specialist in this area to talk about energy innovation networks. Dr. Bumpus received his PhD from Oxford University. He's now a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Business and Economics. He doesn't just talk the talk, he also walks the walk. He's the co-founder and CEO of an energy startup called RedGrid. I think he's going to talk a little bit about that throughout. So the presentation will go for about 35 to 40 minutes. After that, we'll have some questions. So big welcome to Adam Bumpus.
Thanks, Nick, and it's great to be here. I've had the privilege of being at Melbourne Uni for the last 8.5 years, so it's fantastic to be here talking about an evolution of where the research has gone and really thinking about what does it mean for us to be studying and working in clean energy transitions, because this is kind of the challenge we have. We're not, what we're doing in this world is not esoteric academic practice just for the fun of creating some knowledge. That's part of it, but really we're trying to change something. That's what I love about the Energy Transitions Hub here. And I'd like to say thank you to Malte for his support in this work that I've been doing on Australia and Germany and their clean energy ecosystems, and to the Faculty of Business Economics for helping me be here today and paying some rent at home, which is quite nice. But what I really want to talk about today is the key parts of what we understand for energy transitions through entrepreneurship. So I'm looking at why digital energy entrepreneurship. Why is digital so important in this application of entrepreneurship in clean energy? And then I want to talk about a few years of research I've done on accelerators and incubators. And this was looking at, well, we've got all these startups and we've got all these big incumbents who've been doing the same thing for 150 years. Who is connecting them? Who is enabling them to actually make a difference? And then I want to talk about this work in Germany and Australia and kind of understanding what is happening in Germany versus Australia. What are the challenges that we see? And then how do those things link up? And then I want to do something really stupid, which is say what things are going to be like in 2 years' time, which is obviously going to be inaccurate because it's 2 years' time in the future. But I'd like to talk about 2021 because I think 2021 is a critical year for what we're going to see in the energy system, especially here in Australia. So why digital energy? We're at a crossroads right now. We're in a period of massive disruption. We're seeing the 6th mass extinction in the world. We are obviously not where we need to be for our climate targets. We're nowhere near where we need to be for our emissions targets. And we are seeing this massive messiness in society, especially around what are we going to do really with technology for the future. This messiness comes from social economic factors, from political economic factors. It comes from the fact that we are fundamentally shifting the way our economies work. And that is not easy. These transitions are not a simple move. They are incredibly complex. And this is where I start, and when I'm talking with other entrepreneurs and funders and lots of people in this area, is that we are in a sticky situation. We have to peak our emissions by next year and start drawing them down thereafter. The models do not account for anything other than that. And the longer we wait, the steeper we have to make that curve. And so when we're thinking about energy transitions, it isn't just because it's a good, nice thing to do. It's actually an imperative. There is no plan B. And when you're in the entrepreneurial world and you're dealing with people who are not necessarily from the climate world, like we see this all the time, right? Climate change, they don't see this stuff. This is like, what do you mean there's no plan B? What do you mean net zero by 2050? That doesn't make any sense to me. Net zero by 2050 doesn't make sense to most people because net zero is too tough to get to in your mind, let alone actually do it economically. But this is where we need to be for understanding what is going to happen in the future. There are 4 Ds happening in the energy system, which are absolutely critical and have really only been on the scene for the last 3 or 4 years, really, in terms of what's going to happen in the industry. And those 4 Ds are decentralization, digitalization, decarbonization, and deregulation. Now, we've had deregulation for a little longer, but not in the context of these others. And those 4 Ds really worry the industry, because what they spell is a total shift from what we've seen in the past, and the way we generate electricity, the way we use electricity, and who has control over the energy data that sits behind it. And so when we're thinking about an energy transition, we're actually thinking about these 4 things coming in as that confluence of disruption, a real shift. And when we say disruption, you know, disruption is a rupture. It's a dramatic change. And those dramatic changes are starting to occur. We just can't see them just yet. So a colleague and good friend of mine, Steve Cahill from Stanford, talks about these as the 4 horsemen of the energy apocalypse. And this is what utilities are worried about. They are not really worried about other utilities. They're worried about Google. They're worried about Amazon. They're worried about, here, potentially Telstra, anyone who's in the home, anyone who understands consumers. And they're particularly worried about, in terms of technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, and blockchain, post-blockchain solutions. They're worried about these because these have not been the purview of energy utilities. Energy utilities pull out dead dinosaurs, burn them, make electricity, send electricity to consumer, get paid hefty whack. That's the model. These do not filter into that model. And I think this is the way we can view this. Do we know who these guys are? The guy on the left? Any ideas? And the guy on the right? Thomas Edison. Yes, Thomas Edison. So everyone knows Thomas Edison, which is really interesting. But this gentleman is Alexander Graham Bell. Now, Alexander Graham Bell in 1883 basically came up with and patented the telephone system, as it was then, a telegram system. So he came up with the idea that we could communicate over large distances. If you were to talk or were to pull Alexander Graham Bell into 2019, he would not recognize the devices we have in our pockets. They look nothing like the system he envisaged, which was poles and wires and real connection hardware between people. But Thomas Edison, if we pulled him to 2019, he would largely see an energy system that's just the same as he envisaged it at that time. Large centralized fossil fuel generation, yes, a bit of distributed energy coming in, but really we still have the same thing. And these guys, the cool thing about this is these guys did this both in the 1880s. What an awesome decade to be around. Like, we think it's awesome to be around now. The 1880s, there's horse carts, there's the Wild West, and someone comes up with electricity and someone comes up with telephones. That's pretty amazing. But if we think about the electricity system, we have come 150 years or so from there doing the same thing. Whereas we've seen the telecommunication system change fundamentally and alter the way we interact with telecommunications. And that's where we're seeing the energy system move next. This is a paper from a colleague in Sydney that came out a few years ago. But what's really interesting here is these are Kondratyev waves. Basically, the idea that as we go through boom and bust economic cycles, we can actually model them. And they actually turn out to be around about 80 years in frequency. And we can see that that I've forgotten how to use this mouse. The whole point of the Kondratyev cycles is that we're starting to get into, so we had electrical engineering and chemicals, automobiles, petrochemicals, information technology between the 70s and the late 2010s. And Matthews postulated that there would be renewable energy smart grids as the 6th Kondratyev cycle in 2010 onwards. And what I think is really interesting here is that we're actually starting to see, as we think about us being in the latter part of that decade, I think we can say that that is starting to happen, that we are starting to see this, but maybe it's not happening fast enough. Why isn't it happening fast enough? Because disrupting large industries that have had total power for a very long time is an incredibly tough thing to do. And there is very little incentive to change. Yes, there's a bit of policy. Yes, there's there's the idea that they want to serve their customers better, but really there is no real incentive there. You make a ton of money from generation. So why would we bother? Well, we bother because new technologies emerge. because we do see new startups coming through the system which challenge and disrupt those existing systems. But they can't do it by themselves. And so what I did a few years ago is start to look at how do accelerators and incubators help make the transition for these little startups into these, or to compete or to effectively make change in the economy with these large organizations. And I looked at this in kind of three main ways. Ecosystem dynamics at the top. How do our ecosystems work and function? The financial support, the venture capital, the government capital that sits behind how new innovations come to the fore, and of course the technology types that, that create this. And I asked a few questions. The first question is, what was the role of accelerators, intermediaries, and intermediaries as those brokers between those different actors in sector-specific entrepreneurial activities? Now, what I mean by this, sector-specific, is because energy is not about making a next laundry list app that goes on the App Store. It's pretty different to that. It largely is B2B. There's some B2C, but it's really specific in how it acts. To what extent are accelerators important in this entrepreneurial ecosystem, and how do they enable transitions? And that was kind of my approach to say, well, what does it mean to actually have effective acceleration? So why accelerators? Well, who's heard of accelerators before? Okay, so we have about half of us have heard of an accelerator. Accelerators in this context are not like the Large Hadron Collider, which is an accelerator, but the similar principle. Take small things and throw them at stuff as hard as you can until they break or succeed. That's, as an entrepreneur, exactly kind of what it feels like sometimes. There's a very famous accelerator for business called Y Combinator in Silicon Valley. Y Combinator, who's heard of Dropbox? Airbnb? Okay, so these came out of Y Combinator. Small startups with a disruptive idea, a little bit of tech, not much, and the ability to scale this up, went into places like Y Combinator to get help, to get finance, to get mentorship, to get access to customers. And what these accelerators do is take a small startup and enable them to deal with the market, because it's really hard to deal and compete with larger organizations. Accelerators and incubators are two sides of the same coin. Incubators are a business incubator is somewhere where companies go to stay alive, to keep them going, much like an incubator does in real life, to keep them going so they get on their feet, so they're strong enough to get out into the market. An accelerator says, we want to scale this startup quickly, be disruptive, get it into the market fast. And so an accelerator is a really important component of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, because it's wedded to an outcome, which is the success of the startup. And depending on who pays the accelerator, that can change a little bit, but mostly it's about a short period of time where you really take an organization and fire it, superpower it to get out there into the market. In the last 4 years, energy accelerators have come to the fore. So specific accelerators for specific energy entrepreneurs. And that's really strange, because normally it was accelerators for any kind of business that would make a ton of money. Doesn't matter what it was. But in the energy sector, it was realized by a few forward-thinking people that it's a bit tougher in energy to get out there. You can't just go straight to the market. You can't just go straight to consumers, because you have to go through a retailer, you have to have a retail license, you have to go through a whole bunch of stuff. So they worked out that we have to have accelerators to help them. And we started seeing accelerators like Free Electrons, which is an international global accelerator, which has Origin Energy and AusNet services as sponsors of it. Startup Bootcamp, Energy Australia. Here we have Energy Labs. We have a bunch of different really good accelerators, which are there to help these startups get out there into the world. Sometimes they have, well, mostly they have corporate sponsors and they have government sponsors. So it really is about organizations saying, we want to change. To a certain extent. It's also about large organizations saying, we want to know what technology is coming through, because we either want to buy it, acquire it, or squish it. Now, I used to think that was the case most of the time. I've kind of changed my opinion on that, because I've seen large corporates say, actually, this is what we need to do. And I've seen large corporates, I've been in meetings with senior executives at these large corporates who said, you know what, we can carry on doing what we've been doing. We'll survive a little longer, but if we want to be profitable into the future, we do have to listen to what these startups are doing. And it's moved from this idea of just having desk space to this real acceleration of the business model. It's not necessarily about having a really big engineering lab. It is about the business model. How do you commercialize this tech? Annie Kennedy is an Australian who used to work for Greenpeace, then went to California and set up the California Clean Energy Fund, now New Energy Nexus. And he put this quite nicely in a book that came out last year, which was around how entrepreneurs and why entrepreneurs in energy have such a tough time. Because we're going to disrupt this old system. And I like the way I said old King Cole is very true. This is based in the US, but it's still true here as well. We still have that fundamental process. So what are we looking at here? And this is a bit of research that my colleague at Stanford and I put out in Nature Climate Change a couple of years ago. And we looked at the incubators across the US and looked at the kinds of companies that were in there. Were they wave one, which is old school renewable energy generation, or are they wave two, digital energy, using software, engaging with smart meters, optimization, artificial intelligence, machine learning. And we started to see that capital providers were starting to put their money into wave two, as that was going up over time, and that the number of clean energy firms in incubators was actually shifting from wave one to wave two. So we basically went through all the accelerators in the US looking at energy and categorized all of their companies and put them into one or two. So this was a kind of initial preliminary piece of research that basically said there is an increased look at what digital energy is going to do for the landscape. And this is important because in energy, we face a large valley of death. In entrepreneurship, there's a classic thing called the valley of death. It's where you come out of research grants in the universities, nice, safe environment, lots of tea, brilliant. And then you get out into the world. And then you have to get some friends, family, founders, and the fourth F, which is fools, to invest in you. And then you try and find angels and early stage venture capital. And all of this is the valley of death, because in all of this time, you're trying to perfect your technology or get your technology good enough to get to the market, find customers, get out there. And it gets worse and worse as basically you burn through all of your capital until you get to this point. An incredibly difficult place where you've got some market traction, you're able to commercialize to a certain extent, but you're not able to scale. And then you get out to the other end here, you come back up post net cash flow that enables you to then get out and actually create a successful business. That happens for all companies, but technology companies that are just digital software can have quite a small valley of death because they can make money pretty quickly. $2 per person on the App Store, great. Actually, the first person who made $1 million on the App Store had an app that just was a fake fingerprint scanner. Did you see that app? It came out like when the app, 2007, 2006, and basically just you put your hand on it and it scanned your fingerprints, but it didn't actually scan your fingerprints. It was just a graphic. Made a lot of money. In energy, you can't quite do that. The light will come on, it doesn't come on. That's not going to make any money. So we have to take this idea and put them through accelerators. And an accelerator manager in Australia noted this, that it is fundamentally different when we're looking at energy compared to other digital industries. So what does an accelerator do? My background is in geography, and we talk about space. And funnily enough, space is what keeps everything together, and how we understand where things flow to and from. And we can see accelerators as a really interesting opportunity for spaces of flows around capital, knowledge exchange, and people. And so I'm not going to go through this in detail because this is coming out in a paper for economic geography later this year. But the main thing was that these accelerators do two critical things in amongst that capital provision, social connections, and people. And that is that they have an ecosystem and network that they bring together and they facilitate connections. This was the most important thing from all the research we did in Australia. It wasn't necessarily just access to money. It wasn't necessarily just access to knowledge or to people. It was the fact that they actually facilitated those connections, because you can go and do this work without an accelerator. It just takes longer. And when it takes longer, you're deeper in the valley of death. And so there's a really important component of why these accelerators exist and how they create opportunities for clean energy. And we won't go into this, but this I really liked because it kind of explained our research really nicely. We came up with this, but also I didn't know there was a four-way Venn diagram even existed. And apparently it does. How awesome is that? And so when we looked at spatial embeddedness, social networks, capital flows, and knowledge flows, we started to see where all these things sat. And so you can see here, and this is from interviews across Australia with clean energy accelerators, entrepreneurs, and investors. And this was a critical part that showed if we're to understand how we change the energy system, we have to understand the spaces of flows that enable those transitions to take place. The entrepreneurs are a key actor in this transitions process. And that's what I want to talk about now, is this idea of, well, how do we actually get transitions? I went to Europe and worked with InnoEnergy, which is one of the KICs, the knowledge innovation communities. Like we have Climate Kick here in Australia. They have those Climate Kick in Europe, and they have InnoEnergy. InnoEnergy is specifically focused on the clean energy problem. And the knowledge innovation community they brought together had a number of startups that they bring in, and then they have a number of utilities, corporate venture capitalists, and venture capitalists who they bring in from the regime. Now, when we're talking about this, and we won't go into the theory, but the idea is there is a niche of where the economy is, small players, tiny small players that exist in specific locations, and then we have the regime, which is government, which is the political economic structures that we have in society, the large incumbent players that already exist. In the middle, these accelerators link the niche and the regime. And this is really important because the niche and the regime, this is incumbency. This is where we're at right now. This is the future. And so if you can't get from here to here, we can't make an actual change in the transition. And so I hypothesized that these guys were helping connect these things together. And what we looked at here is the process that these accelerators enabled. And of course, when you're coming up with a research thing, you need to say 3 Ps, 3 Ds, 3 Cs, 3 something, all right? That's what has to happen. Anyone who's writing their PhD knows you've got to come up with something at the end. The examiner's going, oh, okay, I can remember that. I am still an academic, so I still believe in it like this, but this is the actual truth. So what happens when you go into these intermediaries, we call them a multi-level intermediary because they link the niche and the regime, but they do it in very specific ways. They do it through curation of the ideas out there. Not every idea that's out there for clean energy is going to work. Some are worse than others. Some are fantastic. But you have to have lots of ideas to get the ones that work. But you need curation, because if you don't have curation, you end up with an absolute mess. Then co-creation. And the co-creation is really between industry, government, and the startups. This is not about a startup with an amazing idea that is then going to kill the industry. It just doesn't work that way in energy. What we have to see is, and what we've seen in the research, is that these ideas are co-created between the capitalists, the venture capitalists who are putting money in because they know the industry really well, the industry, which is the access to customers, and the startup with the new technology. And finally, commercialization, because if you cannot commercialize and get this product into market properly, either with utilities or outside of the utilities purview, it doesn't equal a startup. It doesn't equal a company, sorry. It just equals an idea. And so we basically went through a system here and we've worked out, okay, well, this curation, co-creation, and commercialization is how an accelerator makes this work. Because if you don't have one of those things, you basically, they go in order. If you don't have this, you can't have co-creation, and then you can't have commercialization, and it moves from niche to regime. But if you do have those things, we start to see entrepreneurs being successful, and we start to see changes in the environment of the existing energy incumbents. And what this means, and if you're studying socio-technical transitions, you'll know this graph is a very famous graph that came out 20 years ago or so. What we've done is try and say, well, actually, it's not just a simple, here comes an idea from the niche up into the regime and it becomes this beautiful new technology. Actually, what happens is there's a whole bunch of iterations and interactions that happen as they go through that. And each of these is a small startup talking with the industry, talking with government, talking with capitalists to understand where to go. And so we actually get to a point where, and I've seen this personally, that you start to see competition. Cooperation and competition put together. Now, I didn't make that word up. I'm not a big fan of it, but it does explain it quite well. That when you're working in the startup world and when you're actually trying to create new technologies, new business models, there is always competition. But when you're so small, you have to cooperate. You have to work together to figure these things out and get them through into the niche. And then kind of the cooperation goes away and kind of straight up competition happens. But through these accelerators, competition is absolutely important because it is about iterative business model development. So our classic thinking about disruption has been, here comes an amazing college dropout who's super bright, who's figured it out and is going to disrupt the world. Now, Mark Zuckerberg actually did do that. He didn't need to do any of this competition stuff because he was the 1 in a billion that managed to do that. But in this world, when you actually have to keep the lights on, I mean, if Facebook goes down, yes, it is a tragedy for many people, but it doesn't mean people die. But in energy, we have to keep the lights on. And we have to reduce our emissions, and it's a long-term goal. So we have to understand this competition as a key opportunity for changing the system. So what about Australia and Germany? I started looking at this and thinking, well, how do we characterize what's happening? I looked at the World Energy Issues Monitor last year. It came out in late 2018. And what's really interesting is on the left, we have energy leaders, the incumbents. This is the key leaders of large companies. And basically, they said the things they're worried about most are IoT and blockchain up here. And then they talked to the STET 100, which is a German list of the top 100 most disruptive energy companies. And they said, which ones do you think will have the biggest impact and biggest uncertainty? And again, IoT and blockchain. Artificial intelligence is up here as well as data and AI. And what was really interesting here is they basically said, these are the things that keep me awake at night. This is actually the language they use, the things that keep energy leaders awake at night and the things that excite startups. So I thought, well, okay, let's look at AI and blockchain in Australia and Germany. And I looked at the context of the ecosystem. And you can see in Australia and Germany, there is investment happening in these digital energy ecosystems. It is a specific and targeted approach. Australia, because of the strong opportunity in distributed energy resources, deregulated electricity markets, which means you can play with the market a little bit more. Lots of startups are coming to Australia to actually test their models because we have a deregulated electricity market. And we've got the highest per capita penetration of rooftop solar and lots of grid stress. 24th of January this year, we still have blackouts in Victoria. Yet we have the highest penetration of solar in the world. So we have a really interesting opportunity here. And so when I looked at what was happening here from the perspective of government and finance, it was really about provision of capital and support for these pilot projects. So the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA are helping get pilot projects up, provide capital to more or less later stage companies. And then we started to see here a movement towards private sector and government capital coming together. So Southern Cross Venture Partners, for example, is partnered with the CEFC to provide a fund. Artesian is providing a fund, also supported with CEFC money to go into the accelerators. And so what's happening is we're starting to see these accelerators as genuinely channels for funding. They actually partnered with the accelerators to fund these startups. For Germany, it's a little bit different. Because of the progressive regulatory environment that they've got and obviously strong renewables, it's much more focused, less on venture capital and government capital to provide for startups, but much more investing in communities and regional development, and then testing out what the startups are doing there. And what this means is you start to see here in Australia more money being thrown at startups, but less ability to test those products. But in Germany, we start to see more ability to test the products, but for later stage startups. But there's massive challenges. And one of the biggest challenges here is digital infrastructure lags behind, which is fascinating because when we think about Alexander Graham Bell, and we think about our digital infrastructure for our telephones, which is down there, they're doing really well. That's fantastic. But digital energy infrastructure is really tough. Smart meters are there's a very low penetration of smart meters in Germany. So by 2028, they'll only have 10 to 15% of network users with smart meters in Germany, and they're rolling them out. But it's very slow because people only pay 800 euros a year on their bill, and a smart meter costs about 80 euros. It's who's going to pick up the bill for that? It's actually very challenging. Even in Australia, yes, okay, Victoria, we live in the world of near 100% smart meter penetration. It's not the same across the rest of the country, even though that is changing and people can choose that. But what we've seen here is even in Victoria, where we have near 100% penetration of smart meters, consumer benefits from that are very low. Like who has read their smart meter data? Okay, great. Okay, that's 3 of us. Who, at this point in time in Australia, where are the energy transitions people who are interested in this sitting? Well, right here. And there's only 3 of us who've seen our smart meter data. This is crazy, right? We've got the smart meters, we've had them for years, and we can't see the data. Now that's changing. CFONet is trying to work with this. But we have a massive lag in the benefits. And that means there's a massive lag in why we should even change it in the first place. Why would we invest in startup entrepreneurs who are working with smart meter data? Well, the reason is because we have to make that usable and applicable. The second part here is death by pilot. One of our colleagues from What Watches in Sydney always talks about this, and I think it's perfect. There is often a death by pilot. And that is when you're a startup, the valley of death is long and it's cold and it's dark. And if you're just doing pilot after pilot for 10, 20, 30, 40, $50,000, it's very difficult to keep going, especially when you're not spring chickens. Most of us have had careers and done other things and then coming back into it. It's not like you're 22 years old, although our marketing guy is, which is great for us because he understands how to use Snapchat. The point of it is that we have to have the ability to pay for this. And death by pilot is a very real thing, even for companies who've got significant investment. In Germany, this is a little bit different because the government's support for regional development means there is more support for actually running these projects. Now, of course, we have ARENA and that's doing some good work, but Germany is really investing in place-based innovation. And there's a lot more corporate venture capital that's available in Europe. There's I've interviewed a whole bunch of corporate venture capitalists across Europe, ABB, Energy, E.ON, and they're willing to put money behind startups, serious money, because they want to take it forward, because they have a long-term history of large companies surviving for a long time. Whereas we have quite a high turnover, we have a more of a kind of Wild West approach to it. But what's really cool and what's really interesting is that we're starting to see international collaboration emerging between the startups and the incumbents through these accelerators. And so here's a kind of heuristic of how it's happening. So we've got Germany here with Green Garage and E.ON Agile Accelerator and Energy's Innovation Hub, which is both in Germany and in Silicon Valley. And then these large climate kicks, these knowledge innovation communities for InnoEnergy and Climate Kick. And actually startups are coming through these accelerators and starting to work with international accelerators like Free Electrons, the Energy Web Foundation, which is the accelerator that does, well, it's kind of an accelerator, it does connections for blockchain and energy. And then we started to see Australian companies coming through Energy Lab and Startup Bootcamp Energy Australia, through Climate Kick and up into Free Electrons and then into these other areas. And what this means is that this isn't just them having a jolly. These bits in the middle, the accelerators are actually helping these companies go and do projects on the ground. Actually, so there's a British company, Tempest Energy, that's come to Australia to run pilots. We have organized, Relectrify is one of the Australian companies that went through Free Electrons doing pilots with American Electric Power. So there's really interesting stuff happening because we're not just an innovation isolated ecosystem here. We have to be connected to larger systems, because what's starting to happen is that Australia is the test bed, because we have this interesting deregulated market, but our market is 24 million people. It's not very big. So we have to go overseas to find those markets, and these accelerators are helping facilitate what that is. Again, those facilitated connections. So what does it mean? Well, we have this huge chasm that still exists in energy entrepreneurship, but this facilitation role that accelerators are taking is really important. It is helping these startups get through. Now, we don't have definitive outcomes, definitive conclusions on the percentage of those getting through, because it's too early to tell. Most of the exits are still waiting to happen. There haven't been significant clean energy exits out of these accelerators. We've seen some O-Power, for example, in the US listing, but there haven't been that many. When I talked to InnoEnergy, they were still waiting for their first exit. That's 7 years. So we don't have the fundamentals on the percentages, but we can see these tendencies starting to happen. And the flows are critical to this success. It is not just about people sitting down and plonking away with their computers by themselves. It is really about being in a place where these flows of capital and of knowledge and of human resources come through. And as Nick sort of said at the beginning, this is about structuring. This isn't about just people sitting in their garage coming up with the next invention and then becoming billionaires overnight. It's about structure. And I'm talking, when I work with the students at FBE, there's lots of great ideas, and innovation is a mindset, and entrepreneurship is a mindset and a process. If you don't have the process, you can't get anywhere. In the next few years, commercialization is going to be absolutely critical. So this is the innovation index actually from late 2017, but it shows where Australia is in terms of inputs to innovation, so how much effort you're putting in, and outputs, what you're getting out of it. Germany sits very nice, not so many inputs, lots of outputs. Australia, lots of inputs, not so many outputs. So we have a bit of a challenge here in terms of where we go. And when you look at the actual drivers of, this is clean tech in general, not just energy, we start to see Australia in the blue here has some really good drivers that are out there helping clean tech move forward. But in terms of commercialization, we're pretty far behind the mark. And if we don't have commercialization, this becomes a very low policy priority because it doesn't make any money. 2021. So what does 2021 look like? Well, for Australia and Germany, the needs that we need to be looking at, I think here are more collaboration between the ecosystems. That gives us the understanding of capital versus regional innovation. Systemic in-depth review of startups. Now, as an academic, what you have to say at the end of every presentation is, we just need more research. As an entrepreneur, I actually also believe this would really help because we start to understand the kinds of companies that come through and are successful. And I really think this co-creation component has to be unpacked a little bit more. It is still really hard to tell whether this is swallowing up ideas and startup intellectual property, or whether it is genuinely commercializing new approaches to energy. We still don't know. It's still too early to tell what the outcomes that'll be. The proof will be in the pudding. So we have to really understand what does this mean? Is this a positive or is this a negative component of what's happening in the energy system? We just can't tell yet. But 2021, I think, is going to be a really critical year for us, especially in Australia. And one of the reasons I say that is because the spot price is going to change from 30 minutes to 5 minutes in 2021. It's actually in June 2021, I believe. So we're going to start to see faster price signals happening in the wholesale market. We're going to start to see a lot of that wholesale market risk being pushed forward into energy bills. It's going to start to increase the percentage of wholesale costs into the electricity bill. And from one senior innovation manager that we spoke to, they said there is no system that can deal with that level of data happening in 2 years' time. It's too much. There's too much data flying around to make that really worthwhile, especially when you're trying to deal with demand response to avoid things like the blackouts and overall demand management to actually smooth out those massive peaks and troughs that we start to see. And so there is a call for an automated demand management orchestration. What I mean by that is the ability to orchestrate devices at the edge so that we can have not just demand response, but demand management. That means when the peak is coming, you can start to orchestrate this one switches on, this one switches off, this one switches on, this one switches off, and actually orchestrate that through the ecosystem. And funnily enough, that's what RedGrid is doing. Isn't that incredible? So we've seen here the evolution of the internet from IBM, few hardware players, all the way through to predictive and personalized kind of scary stuff sometimes with Facebook. And we've seen the evolution of utilities, a few centralized players, bless you, flexible choice, moving to DERs, peer-to-peer networks, Power Ledger and Inosi and that kind of lot. And then we're getting to virtual networks and personalized and predictive artificial intelligence. So that's what we're kind of doing at RedGrid. We're putting together the idea that your old air conditioner can then have a brain and can be able to switch and talk to other air conditioners or other energy devices nearby and switch on and off on behalf of their users. What's interesting about that is then the users start to get feedback and to get money, credit, based upon their good actions. And what's really cool about that is when we go back to thinking about Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, the reason we can change this energy system now is because we have fantastic DERs. It is because we are improving our digital infrastructure, especially here in Victoria. And we have now the ability to understand this telecommunication system turned into the internet, which we had no idea. People thought the internet would be like the Minitel in France in the 80s. You know, you can book your cinema ticket and that would be about it. We had no idea that the internet could tell you what all the things we actually take it for granted for. And so with energy, we still don't have any real understanding of what the benefits could come from a fully digitalized understanding of what our energy system is doing. So we're calling this the Internet of Energy, the ability to have an interconnected systems from the device level upwards that enable a response to climate change. And so this is what we're building, connecting all these different devices together using our partners in hardware to actually enable them to make the decisions and control. But we actually sit behind it, a very deep software protocol layer that enables these devices to talk to each other and be rewarded for good behavior. Basically be rewarded by switching off when it's needed and switching on when it is needed, and channeling our renewable energy that we have into the right places at the right times. We've had a bit of traction in this, which has been quite fun. We've just come through Startup Bootcamp. We've just had you can see the bags under my eyes is because I finished the accelerator and then went straight into 6 weeks of trying to eco-insulate my house. So it was like a bit full on. I finished yesterday. But we've been working with some really fantastic organizations who do want to change and who want to figure out what's going on. And we're running some pilots with Spotless, with Energy Australia and Vicinity. And a few weeks ago, in middle of April, I went to a preview screening of 2040. Have you guys heard of 2040? You've seen it? Okay, great. It's what did you think? Mixed bag. Okay, it's going to get better. So mixed bag. 2040 is a really interesting film from the guy who did That Sugar movie, Damon Gameau. Have you seen That Sugar movie? All about swimming in jam and stuff. It's very cool. But 2040 is about what does the future look like for 2040? What is a positive vision of the future? And I watched this, and our first partner we worked with called Soulshare in Bangladesh, who did microgrids in Bangladesh, were the first people we worked with when we were, a company barely had a name. We worked with them, and I saw this, and I thought, this is amazing. We've got to work with these guys. And last week, we finalized the cut of our collaboration between 2040 and RedGrid to bring a crowd equity funding campaign to Australia to bring the ability to have a microgrid built from the device level up. So we're really chuffed about this. This is the shameless plug for RedGrid that is saying, yeah, this is what we're doing. We're opening this crowd equity. We would love you guys to be involved. And so what it means for us in total here is that we are at a massive and critical junction for energy entrepreneurship and these digital technologies. We have to catch up with our infrastructure, but it is happening. We need to improve our incumbent interactions. It's really slow. I know from personal experience how slow it is. That's my timer. How slow it is, and it's really challenging, but we are getting there. And Australia and Germany have an incredible opportunity here to leverage each other's different opportunities in that ecosystem. They are really quite different, but actually that means an incredible ability for our startup to learn from Germany and vice versa. And of course, the internet energy is coming very soon. In fact, we are really excited about a few things that are happening right now where our technology is going to be running in a couple of communities up in Noosa and here in Melbourne. And I also wanted to say that Amanda Cahill is speaking next week at this same time. So tune your watches and your Internet of Energy devices to remind you that you're going to be here next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. When you study policy like I do, it's very easy to be pessimistic about our future. But having done a little bit of work with Adam and seeing the potential for disruption in the energy sector, it does fill you with a little bit of optimism. So we'll take some questions now. And if you want to invest maybe in RedGrid, just wave your cash around and you'll be a millionaire in no time. I've got some roving mics. It's the first one here. Next.
Hi, Adam. Wonderful presentation. I'm Riley from Energy Lab, and I would be remiss of me not to say that our applications for our next cohort close on July 24th. But more importantly, Adam, you've gone through your own entrepreneurial journey, and you've been studying people who have. So I guess I vaguely want to ask if you had one piece of advice for budding entrepreneurs, knowing there's probably plenty in the room. What would it be? Or a couple?
Yeah. So it's the team. So really, before you go into the accelerator, before you really get down that path, try and find the right team. And this is my third startup, and this is the team that really works for me. And so I think the team is absolutely critical. And startup and energy accelerators look for teams. They hired us because of the team. Well, they hired us. They took us in because of the team. We were a super early idea. We're the youngest company. We were only 5 months old when we got into the accelerator. Everyone else had $1 million worth of investment, and we're kind of singing. So they hired us on the team. So the team is number one. And then it's having a little bit of technology that could really do something big, and just focus on that. And so you can don't leave your job straight away and go out and try and start. That 3 pieces of advice. Maintain it for as long as possible, but then get your team sorted and get a little bit of technology, and then go and get some help from accelerators, because at least they'll give you feedback, and they're fantastic. Energy Lab is awesome. Start Bootcamp's awesome. There's some really great people who really know their business. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Okay, so in keeping with the theme of the presentation, we actually have an online question. We do have an online audience.
We do ask. This is a question from Scott Dwyer. Adam, Scott, your mics should be ready to go. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question live?
Hi, Adam. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Scott. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, great presentation, and nailing a lot of the issues there, I think. And my question's around the venture fund. So, I mean, as you said, the venture funds for energy are becoming more numerous and well funded, and I guess with that, they've become increasingly competitive as well. And we've seen major funds established by the energy utilities. I mean, you mentioned Origin, and we've also seen them set up by Shell Energy Ventures, Total Energy Ventures, the other type, energy VC specialists as well, and energy value chain players such as Siemens or Honeywell. So out of those 3 types of VC funds, the energy utilities, the energy VC specialists, or the energy value chain players, which do you see as best placed to make clean energy startups a success, and why?
That's a really good question, Scott. Thank you. They're all important in this, but I would probably say the value chain capital is probably the most important, because utilities can help you understand the system better and help you understand how to engage with that system. The energy specialists can help you define your technology a little bit more, because they know the system really, really well. So that would be important. But the channel partners, the partners who can get you to customers, real customers that you're not really necessarily disrupting their business model. So for example, the distribution network service providers here are really good opportunities in Australia, because you're just helping them do their job better. Whereas retailers, you're also kind of disrupting what they've been doing for a long time. So I actually think the channel partners to get you to customers actually are one of the most important ones. But there are less of those actually than there are of utility funds at the moment. Does that help, Scott?
Perfect. Thanks for that.
Question, John Wiseman.
Thanks, Adam. That was great. I'm going to ask you to, I guess, turn the lens around to the emissions reduction end of the story. So, and maybe I'm even going to ask you to go out a little bit further than 2021 as well. So I guess my basic question is, how and why, convince me, how and why the Internet of Energy is going to make a really major contribution to the kind of rapid acceleration of emissions that's required, and I'm thinking over the next 5 to 10 years. What's that look like? How important is it?
Yeah, that's a good question, John. So right now we waste a lot of energy by not using our devices in the most appropriate ways. We have a capacity market where we will switch on fossil fuel-based generation if we really need it at those high demand response events. And because we're wasting electricity at the consumer end, and because we have demand response, that means we switch on gas-fired generators, we can start to, by enabling us to pull down the energy use that's in households, we can start to, at a distributed level, shift the way we're using our energy. The other part is that all the energy we have sitting on top of our roofs right now is pumping back into the grid, giving money to our retailer, a little bit of money to us. It's not actually being channeled to the right place. And that's because our grid doesn't have the intelligence to understand where those devices could be using that energy in the right times. And so we see the ability of, much like we have the internet on our phones, and the ability for those apps to talk to each other and understand what you want and where you are. So for example, Google Maps. Before, when I first got Google Maps, I would switch off the location tracking, because I'm like, I don't want to know where I am. Now I want to know that my Uber is going to turn up on time and actually get to me. And so there is a lead time here, which is people getting understanding how far they're willing to let the machines run things for them, but still ultimately having the human control. And I think that's where, from an emissions reduction point of view, if we can start to use our solar on our roofs a lot better and more effectively, and we can start to reward people with actual cash in credit for good behavior, we start to shift away from centralized fossil generation. And it's because it's decentralized and because it's the technology sits at the device level and it can't be hacked, we start to see a security that comes with that is private and secure and scalable. And we just don't have that scalability right now. And we see the internet, I mean, the internet very much is a network effect business. The more you have running on it, the better it gets. And we see exactly the same thing for our technology and the Internet of Energy. Thanks.
Neat's brought her own microphone.
I did.
So I ask a question.
I actually want to ask a question that leads on directly from that, Adam. So in that context, can you talk a little bit about some of the privacy issues and the laws around that might be either facilitating or inhibiting in, say, Australia versus Germany, which is the study you recently did?
Yeah, so I didn't study specifically the laws that sit around this. It was more on the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. But there are some specific laws that are important here. So, for example, people have talked about peer-to-peer energy trading for ages, and it doesn't happen. Right? It doesn't happen because you have to trade through the same electricity retailer. The retailer doesn't really have an incentive to let that happen because they're taking a nice cut from your solar. And so that's going to change as we move towards the ability to have multiple retailers basically sitting at your meter. So you can change, of course, you can change your retailer whenever you want, but when was the last time we changed our retailer? Not long ago, or a while back, actually. I actually just did mine because I was fed up with paying so much money. But the point is that's going to change, that those regulations as they change, as they come through the regulator here, they start to open up these opportunities for new digital innovations. So for example, we'll start to see the ability for the smart meter with some artificial intelligence to choose which retailer at the right time based upon that price they're giving them. Effectively, you could actually get down to 5 minutes. That doesn't happen right now, but those changes could happen. I can't really talk about Germany, but I'm happy to take it on note. Thank you.
Yeah, Adam, I'm wondering, how does your digital entrepreneurialism deal with the digital divide, the energy divide? Because we live in a world of increasing social inequality. Is it going to deal with that, or is it going to perhaps perpetuate that?
It's a really good question. So in Australia, about 13% of people sit on the cusp of going into energy poverty and defaulting on their energy bill. 13%. That's a huge amount of people who are sitting there because their bills are going up and it's getting closer and closer to that margin of actually defaulting on the bill. And so we've actually been talking with the hardship groups in some of the retailers to work out how the technology that can save money for those consumers can actually help them deal with this increasing price in energy. Now, that doesn't deal with the structural effects of why those prices are going up, but it does provide some opportunity to change it. I think from us, a lot of the smart infrastructure, smart grid stuff, we don't think we necessarily need a smart grid. Smart grid is imposed. Someone comes in, we're going to make a smart grid. Who gets a smart grid? Wealthy organizations, people, communities, because they want it. It's nice. We don't think we need a smart grid. We need intelligent devices. And if the device is intelligent and can actually make money for good actions that people are taking on with those devices, then we start to bring it up from the bottom up. I fundamentally believe that. And that, therefore, it's not about having incredibly expensive infrastructure. It's about having relatively cheap devices. So $25 smart plug, $90, but amortized over 2 years with a contract for a control of your air conditioner that then pays itself back. We can actually see, we can actually open the opportunity for different socioeconomic strata people to actually engage with this, because they will actually benefit more than other people. So yeah, but this is all to be seen, right? We're still working on it.
Got another online question before we come back to the audience.
Thank you. This one's from Ryan Cook. Thank you, Adam. I'm a current Master of Environment student at UniMelb. You touched on business entrepreneurial vernacular not aligned with climate vernacular. How difficult is this knowledge gap to fill, and what advice do you have for academics, researchers?
Oh, wow, that's an awesome question. Yeah, so academia is a wonderful place, right? We get time and money to think and to write papers and to submit to journals, and we hope someone's going to read them, and sometimes they do. This is why the Energy Transitions Hub is so important, to be honest, is because it's a translator for what is happening between research and government and policy and industry. But we haven't been very good at it in academia about actually working with entrepreneurs. In fact, entrepreneurship, it's incredibly hard to get published in entrepreneurship because especially if you're doing climate change entrepreneurship, because the entrepreneurship people are like, okay, we want the fundamentals of the processes of entrepreneurship. When you talk about climate change, they're like, that is just not an important issue. You know, they just don't see it. They want to see general industry entrepreneurship. So the challenge here is that we're doing an educational piece, basically, which is saying entrepreneurship is tough. Climate or energy entrepreneurship is even tougher. And the industry knows this, and entrepreneurs know this, and slowly but surely the academy is getting that, because we're starting to publish papers that talk about this. So I think the piece of advice would be to work more with entrepreneurs if you're in academia, and work more with academics if you're an entrepreneur. And I don't mean that in a kind of glib way. I actually mean it in terms of things going to hackathons, going to boot camps, going to the kinds of environments where it's helped, where people help put you together. So Melbourne Uni runs a Power Shop Energy Institute hackathon every year. Academics and industry people put together. And we did it last year, and it was amazing, really good. And you have so much insight. So not just about, that kind of glib, hey, we're all working together in, singing from the same hymn sheet and all that kind of stuff. It's not really that. It's actually roll your sleeves up, put yourself in an uncomfortable position, but go in a place that is safe. And that means boot camps, and hackathons. I really think that's the way to do it.
Hi, my name is Muhammad Afzal. I come from local government. We have around 150 facilities and 400 meters. And we want to know what's happening, what can we do on time. And there are about half a dozen retailers involved in that as well. We have smart meters and inverters which are connected, but they don't talk to each other. So we have been trying to get that data, and it's becoming quite a complicated and difficult thing. Though there may be some regulations required for interconnectivity, and also a few university people came with IoT solutions looking for problems. So I think there is a need for more collaboration and tackling the real problem.
That's a really good point. Lots of that links to the previous question. Actually, lots of academics come out with solutions looking for problems, and what we actually need, you have to be in love with the problem, not the solution. Look, there are some real challenges there. You can access that data now through all the different. You might be on the same distribution network, the DNSP. You could probably access the data through that, because you can through most of their. Well, I'm not City Power, so most of their portals you can. But there is an issue there about interconnectivity between different brands and between different kind of systems, because to date it's all been proprietary systems that are that lock you in. Now, the change that we have here is our Internet of Energy is open source and free. So that is, we make the money from being the artificial intelligence things on top, but the actual system is open that everyone can plug into, much like TCP/IP is for the internet. Like, we don't think about that when we send an email. It just runs on the same algorithm that enables my Apple to talk to a Dell, whatever it is. So I think that you're absolutely right, that the problem is there, that we have data, but we can't access it and we can't make it talk to each other. And that's a really key issue. So I'd love to talk to you about that. It'd be really cool. Thank you.
We might take one more question. Adam's, you're going to stick around a little bit after this presentation, and maybe you'll answer a few more questions. But
Hi, Adam.
Hey.
I'm actually running a startup as well. It's definitely a hard slog, but one of the things that you mentioned was where German investment from industry is helping to get more startups into the system. What do you see opening up here, or is there blockages or anything that will help kind of that industry funding of startups?
So German corporate venture capital is pretty strong, and they're involved with InnoEnergy and large organizations. So they're actually part of the governance board of those organizations. So that's where these startups get really good access to corporate venture capital. It is happening here, and it's way better. When I started this research in 2016, it was pretty terrible. Like, there wasn't much happening. But then Artesian, Southern Cross, obviously the Victorian Clean Energy Fund, Clean Technology Fund is involved now and putting money into these accelerators. And what they're doing is, so Artesian's model, for example, is take a small percentage, like 5%, and give you $50,000. Very small seed money, but then they'll follow on with other rounds afterwards. Now, if you're happy with that, that's cool. You can kind of get a bit of money to keep you going. Energy Lab has that deal, so I think, don't they? And so the Startup Bootcamp, and so there's a few others there that the capital exists. I haven't seen so much corporate venture capital. There's been a bit. Energy Australia invested in Redback Technologies, the storage technology from Brisbane, but not too much has kind of happened since then. I mean, there's a bit happening behind the scenes, but not a great deal, I think, in terms of rollout. So we're a bit behind on the corporate venture, and I think it's a company culture issue as well. You know, German companies, we've had long-standing big German companies that are corporate citizens for a very long time. And what's interesting doing the interviews with entrepreneurs in Europe is that sometimes they're making making a company to get investment from a big utility to then get a really nice job sitting in that utility. Because you can get bought up, and then you basically are locked into a contract for 3 years to work on that project in that utility, and then you can stay. So whereas here we're shooting from the hip a little bit more. So I think in terms of capital, it is shifting. There is way more capital now than there was before, but but the curation is going to be the key bit, and how we get to that through these accelerators. And it's still not easy, is it, to get the money? But it's getting better, I think.
Sorry, we're going to squeeze one more online question in before we finish.
Thank you very much. This is from Senhao Kwang from Climate Works Australia. How can accelerators help clean energy tech companies land on developing countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, where barriers, mostly policy barriers, are much higher compared to Australia?
That's a good question. So I think the networked incubator is actually really good because we're starting to see people like New Energy Nexus, the incubators, like kind of a connection of accelerators coming out of California. They're in Shanghai. There's Energy Lab is there an Energy Lab in Cambodia? Is that right? And so there's a number of different accelerators that are kind of landing pads. Now CSIRO and Austrade also have landing pads in California and around different countries in the world. So those exist, but they're not really firing all cylinders at the moment, to be honest. So it is really tough because you can't parachute in a bunch of people from Melbourne straight into a developing country and say, hey, we're going to solve your policy issues. Because we've tried that for the whole of the development project since the early 1950s, and that hasn't worked. So I think there is an important component there for these accelerators and incubators to link entrepreneurs and get them at very early ideation stages, because then they start to understand the real problems. We have enough problems trying to be an entrepreneur in Australia, but we've seen companies like Power Ledger actually do really well overseas in places like Thailand and Japan because the regulatory system works better. So I think it's actually a really cool opportunity with these incubators to link entrepreneurs at a very fundamental level. And then we get solutions that are not just applicable to Australia, but are applicable in different jurisdictions. And then we start to hit our climate goals just a little bit faster.
Okay, really fascinating stuff. I know there's a few more questions. Adam will stick around for a little while. It's clear that the scope for innovation in energy is absolutely enormous, and we're at the very, very beginning of this process. So there is some cause for optimism. Now, Adam's already mentioned our seminar for next week, same time here at 11 a.m. Give a big round of applause for
Thank you.
Bumpus.
Thank you. Fun.